it brings audiences of different generations together. And we are, of course, so divided these days in so many ways. And anything that bridges that gap and that gets us talking and that opens up that discourse and hopefully paves the way to some sort of understanding is, I think, a good thing.
You're listening to OK Podcast, a podcast by Sean Perrin about Radiohead. Hi, I'm Sean Perrin, and welcome to OK Podcast, the show where I discuss the musical and cultural impact of the world's greatest band, Radiohead. Steve Hackman is the musical mind behind the compelling production Brahms vs. Radiohead. It fuses together Brahms' First Symphony with Radiohead's seminal album OK Computer. We discuss the vision behind the project, Steve's passion for both classical and popular music, and how it's helping bridge the gap between musical generations and expose new audiences to the orchestra. You might be surprised, but it's also exposing new audiences to pop music as well. Show notes for today's episode can be found at okpodcast.com/5. Patreon supporters get early access to an extended ad-free version of today's podcast. You can learn more at okpodcast.com. Today's episode was brought to you in part by D'Addario. D'Addario makes some of the world's finest instrument strings and musical accessories right here in the USA. They're committed to sustainability as part of their business practice through the Playback program, which is a string recycling program that has recycled over 2 million sets of strings to date. For more information about this program and how you can help save the environment by recycling your guitar, bass, or orchestral strings, see D'Addario.com/playback. That's D'Addario.com/playback. So I'm here today with Steve Hackman, who's a musical visionary of incomparable gifts. He's a composer, conductor, producer, DJ, arranger, songwriter, singer, pianist, and even a rapper. So Steve, my first thing I have to say is wow, that's absolutely incredible. How did you become all of these things to a professional level?
Okay, maybe rapper should be in quotes. Boy, I want you, if possible, can we hire you to introduce me for all concerts? Because that's quite an introduction.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a journey for any artist, and I've been, privileged to work in a lot of different capacities in popular music and classical music. I've always pursued both in parallel, and on this adventurous journey through many unexpected areas, I've just developed a lot of different disciplines, and it's just always been about how to combine them in a unique way and find some sort of artistic voice. So I think any artist who is making compelling work is always going to be some strange hybrid of different disciplines and aesthetics, etc.
Did you face resistance in your career for this? I mean, even me, I remember in college when my history professor found out that I had more Radiohead than Rachmaninoff on my iPad, that he actually tells me I should quit music. And at the time, that seemed like such an insane thing to say, and I still feel that way. But did you face this kind of sort of pushback for your love of pop at the same time?
I did. And there's resistance that we face head on sometimes from our teachers or our colleagues. And then there's the resistance that sort of builds in our mind because, that teacher that told you that he planted a seed in your mind that then could grow. Your mind could nourish that sort of that impure and unhelpful thought. And so I've faced it in both areas. I can remember I did my undergrad at the University of Illinois, and I had, again, an amazing kind of bifurcated musical experience there. On one side, I had an amazing piano teacher, Gustavo Romero, who opened my world up to classical music. And then I was also in an a cappella group that I arranged for and conducted and produced and all that. And I remember the dean telling me, if you really want to be serious about classical music and have a career, you should drop this a cappella group. And by the way, I'm still close with him. He was giving me the best advice he had, but he was wrong because it was developing those other skills. I mean, first of all, that's how I got started conducting, was leading this small group of musicians. But those producing, arranging, entrepreneurial, management, business skills developed in a group like that, set the stage for all these things to come. So, I mean, I could talk on the resistance thing, of course, for a long time. That's small potatoes compared to some of the things I face from an orchestral standpoint. And, when you think of classical music purists that really object to the work I'm doing. But yes, there's been a lot of resistance, a lot less so now, which is great.
What do you say to those people who are very opposed, or do you just sort of try to turn a blind eye to them or not pay attention, or how does that work?
Well, the problem is it's not a conversation I get to have. And that's what I also mean about something being in your mind. Of course, when I'm on the podium conducting, we feel each other. The orchestra, all the musicians are playing together, and there's that kind of organic music making, and you're feeling everyone's energy. And then from the podium to the players, of course, it's a constant transmission, two ways of energy. And so if somebody's not if they're not feeling the whole concept of the piece, and if they are just categorically opposed to doing something like Brahms First Radiohead, I can hear it in their playing, I can see it on their face, and I can feel it in their energy. And then if I hear, an anecdote or, gossip about some player that made some comment off stage, then it just grows in my mind. And that I have to say, I think that phase of my career is over. But it was not easy, and I want to say really specifically, I don't blame people for objecting and being somewhat skeptical that this is going to be a convincing piece, because it's a wild concept, and I love this music just as much as they do. The Brahms First Symphony is just as sacred to me as to them, so I get why they would object, but to not have an open mind to play it and experience it, and to not be open to, a group like Radiohead, I do object to that.
So Brahms versus Radiohead was, I believe, your first sort of mashup idea, but you've also done Bartók versus Björk, Beethoven versus Coldplay, and Tchaikovsky versus Drake. Would you describe the moment in your career that led you to this concept?
So we call them fusion shows. I'm going to jump in right away and correct that, because mashup, the connotation of mashup is, I don't know, it's something I kind of don't want to be associated with, because it makes it seem a lot more. It makes it seem a lot more sort of trite, I think, than it is. But that gets to why people, again, may object or may have skepticism, because they think, oh, mashup. I mean, come on, this is just going to be, it's going to be surface. It's going to be artificial. It's some sort of gimmick, but. Anyway, in my career, again, it's been classical and popular in parallel the entire time. And ever since my days at Curtis, where I went to grad school, I kind of was in the closet as a popular musician there, much like maybe you felt like you were with your teacher. So I hid the fact that I was writing songs and producing albums and playing out in bars and all these things. But I always sort of longed to combine the things. I always thought, wouldn't a recital be amazing that juxtaposed popular with classical music, and did the former with the same virtuosity and level as the latter? And so that was just built in, I think, to me as a musician. And it was a mission of mine. And it was really at the Indianapolis Symphony where I was brought in as a creative director and conductor, back in 2010, that I started to experiment this together with my friends in this group, Time for Three. And that began the journey of these pieces, of the combinations and the synthesis and the juxtapositions and all that.
What specifically led you to Radiohead with Brahms? Was it a love for two works in particular, or just happenstance, or how'd that come to be?
My love for those works originates at about the same time in my life. The Brahms one was my audition piece for Curtis and Juilliard. So I was studying it intensely when I was 19. And that's about when I fell in love with OK Computer as well. So somehow those have always coexisted in my mind. And then when the opportunity arose with the Indianapolis Symphony, the date was there. I had the fortune to be able to write a full work. The orchestra had just played the Brahms one a few weeks before, so the stars sort of aligned, and then it was just about figuring out how the heck to write it.
So how did you figure out how to write it? How did you go about selecting the songs that would go with the musical moments and the symphonic sections and vice versa?
So for Brahms versus Radiohead, the film familiarization process was sort of built in because I already, again, had a great intimate knowledge of both pieces. But that was requisite for this because I needed to write it very quickly. So I just started to consider the marriage of these two and, just had them on in my headphones as I was kind of going through my day, whether I'm at the gym or walking around or driving. And then I would hit the piano, and I already had a kind of rough roadmap just from sort of living with the pieces for a few days about which songs I thought would work at which points in the movement. And then it was about, just being at the piano and getting to that moment and then just starting to improvise and, being in that sort of closing theme in the first movement and figuring out how Karma Police works there, or being at the end of the beautiful horn solo in the fourth movement and let's go to C minor instead of C major and let's see if we can get exit music in here. It was just really experimenting and improvising.
So you make it sound so effortless. Where do you feel like the skill sets are coming from to do this?
Well, it's everything. I mean, I've been arranging music and writing music for a long time, as long as I can remember, really. I guess when I started piano, I started just because I was sort of improvising at the piano. I can't remember a time I wasn't sort of, again, just arranging and retranslating music for different mediums. So I was obviously relying heavily on those skills. So arranging, improvisation, and then counterpoint is huge because a facility with counterpoint is what allows me to take music like Radiohead's, which already has rich counterpoint in it, but add layers that are Brahms-like to that already existing counterpoint. So I think that's a huge skill that's in the mix as well.
How would you sum up counterpoint in a word for those who maybe haven't encountered this term before?
Counterpoint is the process of creating a musical line that marries perfectly with an already existing one.
I feel like you've reached a point where this is as artistic as an endeavor as either of the two works. Has that been the feedback that you've received, or how has the reception been? I
think there are those that have that reaction to it, certainly. Obviously, it's derivative in nature, but I do view it as a new work. You could have a rich discussion that is based in both, copyright law and also just based on artistic authorship and ownership and the creative process. But I feel like these are new works, and I especially feel as time has gone on, and I've written more and more of them, and the synthesis becomes more and more thorough, that they become more and more original.
So, I've had trouble posting even just cover songs on YouTube. I imagine that this was something that had to, of course, be licensed. Was that process difficult, or have you heard from the band or any of their agents as far as what they sort of think of it, or?
Well, they are letting us do it, which is the best blessing we could possibly get.
Yeah.
I didn't have the communication line to them until about a year ago. And once I got that through my lawyer, we reached out, and luckily the band heard it and said, thumbs up, you can keep doing it.
So they've actually heard the pieces.
They have, yeah. They, as my lawyer described it, he was on the phone with their manager, who was on a conference call basically with the band. And they just basically all kind of looked at it, and that's how it was told to me,
wow.
Or at least, yeah.
That's really great. Well, I imagine they'd be big fans of it too, because, Johnny Greenwood, the guitarist, is actually also a film composer, and I'm sure this was right up his alley. And, I'm actually wondering if any of them have snuck into a show at some point.
Well, I don't know. I would love to share this music with them. Obviously, I know Johnny Greenwood's work very well as a composer, and, he has a great affinity for 21st century music, Arvo Pärt and Paderewski and things like this. So I wonder if he would think that this treatment is a little too conservative or romantic. But I do know that he loves the Brahms First Symphony because he tweeted it once. And as soon as he tweeted it, I tweeted him the Brahms Radiohead, and he didn't respond.
something we can't know, but I'm wondering your thoughts is, what do you think Brahms would think of it?
This is Radiohead seen through Brahms's lens.
Mm-hmm.
That's the important thing to remember.
Yeah.
And, you've got purists on both sides. You've got classical music purists, and then you've got Radiohead purists. I know because I've seen the comments on YouTube and I've, seen posts on social media. There are people that come to this expecting to hear that sort of, the Tom York style kind of nasal vocals. And by the way, I don't say nasal like in a deprecating way. That's I'm a huge fan of his, of course.
It's the way that
but
it is.
Expect, they expect to hear Johnny Greenwood's Telecaster shredding, and then you hear it completely translated into this very classical, almost traditional form. And so I just want to say there that there are Radiohead fans can find this not to their taste as well. But I would think Brahms would enjoy, again, because I'm using his lens. I'm translating Radiohead into his voice and using his contrapuntal style, using his harmonies directly at time, his progressions at time. And I don't know. Well, first of all, I would like to think Brahms would love OK Computer just as it is, because it's an incredible piece of art. But hopefully the fusion as well.
That was another question I had, is what would you think Brahms would think of Radiohead's work as it was? And, I have a feeling that a lot of past composers would actually be a little more open to the pop music that we have today than some current classical people seem to be. I mean, there are so many composers from the past who drew heavily on folk music.
Of course. I mean, where else does it come from?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, it comes from the earth, and it comes from us. So I completely agree with that. I think that, listen, with Radiohead music, everybody listening is going to, I think, agree with this. There is weight and there is substance to it. There is an honesty to it. It's artistic. Listen, I love pop music and I love number one hit records. They have craftsmanship and they have style and they're polished and they're fantastic for a certain purpose, but there's a lot of marketing in that music. A lot of times that those number one hits can just be propaganda for an artist. Sometimes it's, that rare kind of hit pop song that is in itself something, amazingly artistic and beautiful. But with Radiohead, and with bands that are like them, like the Beatles, like Pink Floyd, like Kendrick Lamar, you get the sense that this music is real and pure and honest and has weight and has importance and significance and meaning. And I can't imagine a Chopin or a Wagner or a Bach or a Mozart hearing that and not at least identifying that there's something here to be listened to.
So with this whole fusion, you have showed great restraint by including only the symphonic instruments. Was that an attempt to be very true to the sense of seeing it through Brahms' sort of lens, or was that decision made for a different reason?
Again, it's an intention to see it through the lens of Brahms. I want the audience to have a classical music listening experience in that they are seated. I mean, if they don't, I would love if they want to stand, they can stand, but most of these halls you sit. But you're there for 70 minutes, and you have an emotional, hopefully transformative journey with this music from beginning to end. So that was by design.
So you talk about the audience, and it's for sure that you're bringing new audiences to classical music, but do you think the reverse is true as well? Have any hardcore classical folks been turned on to something like Radiohead or Drake after seeing one of your concerts?
Oh, absolutely. It definitely goes both ways. I had that conversation during the break from rehearsals today with one of the musicians in the Calgary Phil, and she was saying how she didn't know Radiohead and she went back and listened to it. So I know that takes place with the orchestral musicians, because a lot of times, being in the classical music sort of profession, they don't know a band like Coldplay or Drake. And I know that might sound, surprising, but listen, they devote their lives to classical music. So, they might not have time to listen to, Drake. So it happens for the musicians, but it happens for the audience too. Absolutely. I was in residence with the Pittsburgh Symphony for a few years, and there was a group of folks that were older for as far as the average audience was concerned for my series there, which was called Fuse. These folks were above 50, and they came because they would know the classical composer, but they would get turned on to some popular composer that they never knew before, and then they would go check it out. So, listen, I think Coldplay and Drake and Radiohead, I think, need less help than Brahms does as far as exposure, but it's wonderful in both ways, and it's just wonderful to get those two audience factions together, and have an experience together.
Well, and I love the fact that it lets people, from different generations, especially, see more eye to eye. Like why, and a great melody is a great melody. A great song like Paranoid Android, with especially that choral section, I think that would really resonate with more classical musicians if they knew about it.
Well, you bring up a wonderful point. That's a great point. It brings audiences of different generations together, and we are, of course, so divided these days in so many ways. And anything that bridges that gap and that gets us talking and that opens up that discourse and hopefully paves the way to some sort of understanding is, I think, a good thing.
We talked a lot about performing their music and arranging it, but have you seen the band themselves?
I have. I've seen them many times. Starting in the Kid A era.
Oh, wow. So lucky.
So Kid A, Hail to the Thief, In Rainbows. Yeah, I think I saw all those tours. King of Limbs as well, I think.
Yeah, it's excellent. They're so great live. And one of the things I love about what they do live is they always bring a new energy from, for example, tracks from Kid A are totally out there on the record, but then when they play them live, I mean, I've even heard them use harmonica, for example, on Kid A, and he actually sings the words to Kid A instead of using that strange vocal effect. How have you found their live performances versus the studio performances? With someone with your level of, listening and musical interpretation.
Well, I would agree with what you said. I've always thought their live experience is very special, is very transformative. The production elements are obviously always stellar. I think about the light show in Rainbows. That was unbelievable.
Oh yeah.
I think that was one of those long column of lights. The studio tracks are already so evocative and vivid. I think they do an unbelievable job live of realizing that and then adding another element of, again, avant-garde and experimentation and creativity, really. They're of course not a jammy band, or it never becomes about any of their kind of individual musicianship or virtuosity. It always stays on message as far as it's just about their creativity and this world that they create through their music. And you have to respect that.
I wonder if the virtuosity is almost sometimes in the restraint. Like, I never am watching Radiohead and feel like they're showing off, but yet I feel at the same time like they are just incredible performers, So at what point do we get into the music where it's someone is clearly of virtuosic skill, but almost choosing not to express that on stage? You know what I mean?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why it's artistic.
Mm-hmm.
You just touched upon one of the, I think, core principles of creativity in general. It's just knowing when not to do something.
Yeah.
It's understanding, when to play that certain card. And yes, again, it's about their artistic message on the whole. It's not about the virtuosity or any sort of kind of showing off or any showmanship. That's just not what they are. You have to, again, I'm just in awe of that, actually.
Yeah, you touch on something which Brad Osborne, who is an author of a book called Everything That's Right Place, he was actually my guest on episode 2, he called it the Goldilocks effect, where they just know exactly how far to push things, but never quite break the boundaries. And he actually sent in a listener question. He says, what were some of your favorite rhythmical moments in both OK Computer and Brahms, and how did this influence your arrangement?
Well, I will first start by saying that a lot of the Radiohead music is transformed so that it can coexist with the Brahms.
Mm-hmm.
So one driving rhythmical moment I think of is when electioneering is inserted right at the point where we should go into the coda, the home stretch of the fourth movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that music, the Brahms original, is this yun da da dun da da dun da da dun da da dun, like that. It's very driving, as you know. And electioneering, kind of has this driving but kind of lilting, that electric guitar groove. And then of course the drums come in crashing and super trashy. So that's a really fun rhythmic combination, I think. Hearing electioneering over that sort of insistent ostinato in the low strings.
For those listening, which songs were you able to integrate into your fusion, and which ones did you omit, and why?
Well, this piece was a journey. So it's gone through a couple revisions. So in its current state, everything is in except The Tourist and Fitter Happier. Okay, we touch on everything else. But in the original version, Lucky wasn't in there, Climbing Up the Walls wasn't in there, and Airbag was only in there. I sort of teased the opening cello/electric guitar riff, and the opening of that record is a cello doubling the electric guitar, which is great in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the original version didn't have that. So in the second version of the piece, I added in an airbag section that fits between the first movement introduction and the first movement exposition proper. And then in the next revision of the piece, which I did about a year ago, I added in Climbing Up the Walls and Lucky. And that was because those are just incredible songs. And we would always get feedback from Radiohead fans when we played this show. They'd be like, "Oh, that was, amazing, but how could you not include Lucky or Climbing Up the Walls?" And I would always say, I know, I wish they were in there. So I was like, you know what? Like, I just need to write these things in. So the piece is about 70 minutes as it is. And I unfortunately just don't know if it's in the cards for The Tourist to make it in, but we'll take, 10 out of the 12 songs if you, Fitter Happier. I mean, we can argue whether that's a song proper or not. But.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, given the fact that you want to stick to the symphonic instruments, I imagine that one would be a bit of an odd one to try and fit in for sure as well. So
we played it over the PA in one performance in between the second and third movements, and just put the lights down. And I'm not sure how successful that was.
I imagine there were some confused members of the audience.
Might have been. Yeah, might have been.
So before we go, I was going to ask, what is your next fusion plans, and are you ever planning on incorporating any more Radiohead albums?
Yes and yes. Okay, so I just finished a piece I'm calling Igor Damn Stravinsky, which is Kendrick Lamar's Damn mixed with Stravinsky's Petrushka. And I can't wait for that one. We'll premiere with the Indianapolis Symphony in May. And that piece, for the first time, I went in order with both the classical work and the popular work. So in all the other fusion pieces, it always follows the form and the structure of the classical work, but then I would just work in whatever songs at whichever moments. But in this case, I went right in order with the Kendrick Lamar album, which was a challenge, but a ton of fun and an amazing experience. And I can't wait for that one. Radiohead, I would love to do a Brahms Radiohead Part 2 eventually with either In Rainbows or Kid A and another Brahms symphony. So, once I've played the Brahms Radiohead with all the great orchestras, we'll just do another one.
I love it. And, I love the idea of both of those, but I especially love Kid A, with that being my favorite album. And I can't imagine how interesting that would be with the experimental timbres on there, trying to fit them in with the orchestra. So.
Well, again, so it would need to be in a reimagination of that, but who knows? Maybe it's not Brahms. Maybe it's Kid A with something totally contrasting from Brahms to kind of highlight all the avant-garde elements of that album.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrapped up?
A lot of people sometimes say to me when we're having these conversations, well, why combine, existing works? Why don't you just write your own music? And so but that is something that I do myself as well. So I would encourage folks, if they're interested in hearing more, to check out Stereo Hideout, because that's my original music that of course draws from classical and popular techniques and forms. So you can see it all at Stereo Hideout on social media and all that stuff.
Absolutely. So I'll put links to that in the show notes. And this is an extra special sort of recording, interview recording for me, because actually on Saturday I get to go see Brahms versus Radiohead. And so, Steve, I have to admit, I have still not watched the entire piece because I do want a little bit of element of surprise. So, but I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm super excited about this entire experience and this endeavor that you've done. So thank you for bringing the Radiohead to the classical community. And thank you for all that you have done.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I'll say that, the Calgary Philharmonic, they are phenomenal. And it is going to be, tomorrow night with the Brahms First Symphony, and then to transform it into Brahms Radiohead is a total privilege and honor for us. So I'm glad to be here, glad to talk to you, and I hope to see you on Saturday.
Show notes for today's episode can be found at okpodcast.com/5. As I said, I'm super excited to see this show this weekend, and if you want to get some pictures of the event while I'm there, and maybe even some behind-the-scenes footage if I can sneak backstage, then be sure to follow my Instagram and Facebook pages. It's facebook.com/okpodcast or Instagram @okpodcast. Have you seen this show, or do you know of some other fusion concept with Radiohead mixing with classical music or some other genre? Send me a message at hello@okpodcast.com, even if it's just to say hi. I love hearing from fans all over the world. Today's episode of the podcast was brought to you in part by D'Addario. Don't forget to check out their playback program, which recycles strings and helps save the environment. Guitar, bass, or orchestral strings are eligible, and you can learn more at d'addario.com/playback. Also, did you know that Patreon supporters get access to an extended ad-free version of the podcast? Check it out at okpodcast.com and get access for as little as $1 a month. My name's Sean Perrin, I'm your host, and I'm signing off from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I look forward to talking to you more about the world's greatest band next time on OK Podcast.